Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Arpita, and today we're going to be talking about Roe versus Wade and what this means for women's rights in the United States. And we have Manu joining us here today.
Yeah. Hi, Arpita. My name is Manu Multani. Also happy to be back on this podcast. It's been so long. And yeah, like Arpita said, we're going to talk about Roe versus Wade in the midst of everything that's going on today politically. And we thought that maybe we can kind of distill the conversation to more layman terms and less dramatized, sensationalized as it is in the news, just to kind of really talk about the core issues of the legislation. I'm not a policy expert, but definitely sort of what it implies for human rights in general, and also sort of how to bring that into a space where you feel like you're a little bit more connected to the movement, if that's sort of what you're looking for.
Yeah. I guess we could get right into it. So, can you do you want to start us off by just telling us a little bit about Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, I guess the legislation, when it was passed in 1973, we have a tendency, I think the main point is that we have a tendency to forget how that legislation sort of was brought into place and actually solidified and codified. I think people forget that there was a bunch of activism that kind of led into that issue coming to light and actually receiving enough visibility. And so right now, as the legislation stands, it's providing access to abortion. It's about giving people the agency to make their decision at a federal level. It is still kind of operationalized statewide. I don't know each specific state's legislation and how they sort of kind of practice with it or fund it, right? Which is another aspect too of whether or not federal funding can be used to provide this service and how those dollars kind of get funneled into expenditures that are related to not just giving that procedure, but also clinics that are actually providing that procedure and might be running their operations for other reasons. So there's like different ways in which this sort of legislation manifests. And the question today is whether or not states should have the autonomy to make the decision on whether or not they want their funding to go towards such processes and procedures.
Yeah. I'm really interested from the perspective of like how does this impact women, specifically low-income women or women of color who have a harder time accessing these sorts of services when they need them, and kind of if it makes the whole process a lot more difficult, then what are the alternatives that are available?
Yeah, I mean, so I kind of want to talk about the language too around women just having pregnancies. I think it would behoove us to recognize that there are also people that don't consider themselves women, don't identify as females, that also consider themselves non-binary and also, transgender. And so just to kind of open up that this is also, it's really fundamentally a human rights issue, even though we're trying to kind of distill the data and trying to distill the evidence to say women do this, women do that. It only affects these women and these communities. I think it also leaves behind a much larger community that also needs to be part of this conversation and brought in. But with that being said, our economic public health fields, kind of look at this through a very binary women-driven gendered issue. And so what does that mean? So the consequences of that is that, our statistics or evidence is all drilled down to one specific gender. And, while I want to still talk about those sorts of details and kind of debunk some of the myths around understanding abortion and access, and who's actually going and seeking these procedures or pursuing this choice that they should have. The consequences of this are economic, political, educational, on a more like nuanced, intersectional sort of way. I was just reading recently that like not having access to this choice really kind of hinders your educational opportunities, and really then hinders your job opportunities and kind of forces you to stay stuck in one sort of class. We come from a very racial, very class-oriented society in the US. And so for me, I feel like my stance is really, this is a more of a political maneuver on the Republican side than it is more of an ethical maneuver, that they kind of embedded in this whole, trying to save life and trying to think that there is life at inception. And so that sort of morphs what the real sort of moral panic is. And I think that moral panic is around controlling sexuality and also making sure the poor stays poor. And that's kind of like the economic consequence that I think they're driving for politically in order to sustain their own power and their own sort of position politically.
Yeah. I don't know. This is I guess it's a challenging conversation for me because, like, I have friends who are Catholic, who are very devout Catholics. And so I think for them, this issue, of inception at birth is such a huge factor that it kind of, it's part of the reason that they vote Republican. It's part of the reason that they make a lot of choices that they do. And so, I wonder, and like the controversial nature of it, I think can often lead to a lot of the, it's just very, very hard to talk about or make any headway in understanding, because simply because I think it is presented as such an issue of morality, and it feels so difficult to break away from that concept, right? Because you have whole communities that really see that as the right thing to do.
Yeah, totally. And I think, we're also a Western society, chooses to use components of, our social identity. And I think broadly in general, societies are sort of wired that way, that we kind of play identity politics in order to really choose a stance and where we sort of understand an issue or where we want to hold ourselves accountable, which, is human nature to do. And I also think that, you can, the lines are kind of gray, right, as to where and how scientifically, biologically, physiologically, a pregnancy is understood versus how it's translated into religious text and how that's even interpreted, right? And so, as a sick woman too, the question of abortion doesn't really arise in our scripts, but it's kind of implied in different ways, and it just depends on how you sort of process that information and who's preaching that information, right? And how it's sort of understood. And my husband's Catholic too. And so what does that mean for his family and the extension of that, and sort of how it plays into your family dynamics and coming from an Indian society, it's sort of like that's sort of what you hold on to, because if you want to hold on to your Indian identity, you need to hold on to these morals, these ethics, and that's how you sort of fit, right? And so while we're broadly thinking about these questions of belonging, and especially as it relates to American society dealing with depression, isolation, and all of this happening in our day and age, then what do we latch onto? What are we trying to find? How do we understand that psychologically? What kind of resources are we lacking in other spaces? When it comes to keeping ourselves healthy, keeping ourselves connected. So it's very nuanced. And then it kind of like plays into this whole kind of umbrella of broadly our society being really obsessed with sexuality. I was listening to this talk that my dissertation chair was having, Michelle Marzullo, and she was kind of sharing, she's like, my students constantly ask me, like, why are we so obsessed with like this issue? Why can't we let it go? Over and over again, we kind of find ourselves questioning this piece of legislation like every year. There's some sort of facet that's kind of coming up. And she, said something really fascinating. She was like, our society is really obsessed with sexuality. This is how you build societies. This is how you progress. This is how you evolve. And so while it seems a little bit kind of essentialist and biologically driven, but maybe, there is a piece of that that's true, that we're all kind of trying to reproduce only the kinds that we like, unfortunately, and the kinds that we want around us. And so that's why I think the political theory that I have, or the theory that this is a very political issue, is that that's at the center of it, is that only certain people need to succeed, and only certain people need to have access to resources, and only certain people should be given that right.
That's super interesting. So a couple of things, right, that come to mind for me, and as like being an Indian woman who like originally immigrated from India but grew up here. So I think there are a lot of things that there's this there are also these struggles that I have internally, because in India there's actually a really high infecticide, or I don't know if it's called, it's a high abortion rate for women, for female gendered babies, it's usually, like women don't want to have other girl children. They would prefer to have male children. And so they have abortions for that reason. And then personally, like, it's also a challenging issue for me because my brother had a genetic terminal illness and I may be a carrier. And so thinking about what does that mean if, God forbid my child ended up, or I had a pregnancy and I found out that he had a genetic, or my son had pregnant child had a genetic illness. And I often wonder like how all of these rules would impact my decision making or the future, my future as a parent in these types of situations.
Yeah. And it is sex selective, right? Like certain conditions are. And, you bring up a couple of things that are like super challenging, right? Is that people do pursue this option because they have the right to understand how they want to be a parent, and that is really missing from the conversation. I used to be a talk line counselor for people who are at any part of the spectrum of pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion, or wherever they were contemplating their pregnancies. And that experience, and, I've had people who are devout Catholic and Christian coming up and saying like, this definitely goes against my ideals and stuff, but I just am not there, And to be fair, it's like that's what you kind of need to be able to kind of hold, right? Is that option needs to be there. And in the case of India, abortion is legal in the country. It's not just legal for rape and incest, it's legal in general. But it is kind of manipulated to be sex selective. Yet, it's illegal to be a sex selective abortion provider. And so things in situations like that, and also in situations that is sort of culturally nuanced, right? And in situations in like the US, you are then encouraging underground abortions. And then what does that actually imply in terms of the livelihoods and the health of the people that are undergoing these procedures, right? So instead of thinking about making this issue like illegal, what you're doing is like you're consequentially saying, well, you're up to your own devices. Because I honestly believe the person who wants to have an abortion will do it. Like, will find the way to do it, because at the end of the day, parenthood is such a huge responsibility that I think each person in our society, in our world, understands the consequences of that, and like, is there enough to understand that this is not going to be the best scenario that I'm going to raise this child in? And so, or this is not the time, or this is just not what I want to do with my life. Like, these are fair things that people need to be given autonomy to kind of think through. And then when you come from like a patriarchal society like India, sex selection then helps sort of perpetuate, patriarchy, right? In that context is like, okay, yes, we want to just have sons because the way legislation works, the way policy works is that sons get all the land, they have the land rights, they're going to be able to take care of us. They're not the ones that are leaving the home when they get married. It's a very patriarchal society, so let's just keep it this way and continue our lives this way. There's like no other way of sort of thinking or being or belonging. But yeah, you bring up some really good points. And I think that kind of also, talks about, who gets abortions, and I was kind of looking at some stats and stuff. So certain organizations like Guttmacher and the National Abortion Federation, they really keep a pulse on sort of these stats. And, they have some stats that I think it would be helpful for us to talk about, is that most abortions, 88%, are obtained in the first trimester of pregnancy. And this is from the National Abortion Federation. I don't have the year exactly. I think it says 2003. This was like the most comprehensive one from then. And then of the women obtaining abortion in the year 2000, 57% had some college education, 88% were from metro areas, and 57% were low income. So yeah, it kind of like goes back to your point, when you see these socioeconomic sort of factors, then you're sort of like, well, what's the purpose of this? If this is really who it's affecting. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think are some of the broader implications that are that you feel coming out of this?
I think there's two major ones. The first one is, what does it even mean in terms of our human rights in general, right? Like, yeah, this is a very gendered issue. And the way it's written in legislation is very much binary, heterosexual. And so, what does this broadly mean in terms of questioning our bodily human rights at a federal level, but then also what the implications would mean at the state level, right? Which is what the ultimate consequence of this is going to be. is putting the onus on each state to address this issue how they want. And then furthermore, sort of what does this mean in terms of contraception? There's definitely conversations now happening about questioning at what point a contraception is acting. What is the chemical makeup? And how legislators can sort of interfere in the FDA sort of processing and approval of these medications. And so not only does that add an additional layer of already what is sort of an archaic approach to birth control and the science of that all, and who's historically been part of those studies and research, and how it's really already not tailored for people of color because they haven't been historically part of those scientific trials. And you know, all the other consequences, cultural consequences of that. But, you know, what does that actually mean in terms of further developing contraception if there's this additional barrier, which is also the intention of doing something like this. And then also, you know, sort of this whole conversation around rape and incest. Like, at what point do I need to prove that this is what's happened? You know, why do I need to prove that this is what's happened? And sort of what does that mean as a woman to go into court having to have all these things done to me to prove something that's happening to my body is not what I want? You know, like, it's already like, what is it? It's kind of like, what's the word that they use where you like kind of perpetuate harm while you're trying to think that you're trying to help someone, but you're actually making it worse. And so, like, you know, at what point is that okay to be like, oh yeah, legally I've had this done to me, and now so the police and the criminal system and everybody believes that it's true, and now I should go take care of my health. Meanwhile, this whole like agency has its own bureaucracy and is going to take its own sweet time to do what it needs to do. It's not going to care about how long my pregnancy is going, you know? So there's that added challenge. And then let's put on race on top of that. If you're a person of color going into these systems, how seriously are you going to be taken? You know, so there's all these different systems that are working against you. And yeah, so it really reflects poorly on society.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it sometimes feels overwhelming to think about what the implications can be for, like, even for someone like me who has to make those types of decisions around, like, or potentially have to make those decisions in the future, to know that, like, these are laws that are outside of me, and they could potentially severely impact my life.
Yeah. I mean, we're in California, and, you know, so like a part of me is like, I'm fine with paying higher taxes if that's still something that's available to every citizen of California or every person in California, documented or not, you know, and it needs to be a fundamental human right. But there's still conversations about whether or not that's still going to be the case for California. And yeah, and that's scary, you know, and that's like super terrifying, because I think for the longest time, I personally was like, oh, that's not going to happen in California, you know? And that's also something that's really, I think, not really hitting home for a lot of people, is that the consequences of these does trickle down, even though if you feel like you're in a protected state. And what does that mean to be a sanctuary state? And how long can that continue if somebody else comes into power? Like, what does that mean if somebody else is a governor? What is that going to mean later? You know, so it kind of just opens the floodgates for uncertainty. Yeah. So there's a lot of that. But I think I want to go back to what we started talking about, right? Is that something like this happened because people spoke. You know, this is not the time to be quiet. It isn't. If you can donate $2, if you can donate $5, if you can donate $100, if you can make something happen to places like all options or the National Abortion Federation or Planned Parenthood, all these services that are really organizing themselves to really be at the forefront of fighting this legislation and showing up dedicated, that will be really, really helpful. And I'm not saying taking to social media is not helpful. It is healthy. It's good to be in dialogue. It's good to tell people where you stand. But I've also realized, like, anytime I post anything about abortion or whatever in my circles, no one responds, And then if I do anything about, oh yeah, this person had a child, or this is about family forward, then people are more willing to respond. And I think it's also sort of the fear of not knowing how to hold that space, as a society, especially in the Indian community. It's just something that's not talked about, and no one proudly shouts that this is what's happened to them. And I don't think that's just an Indian society thing, but I think it's just a little bit more easier for me to talk about because I consider myself a part of that society. But yeah, I think voicing your concerns and saying that these things are what's necessary and understanding sort of the trickle-down effect of your sort of rights and where you're going, what kind of person you're going to be in American society is very important. And, if you need a talk line, all options is a talk line. The number is 1-888-493-0092. Call them up and just be like, this is what I'm thinking about. This is what people are here for. And this is what I need. How do I get it? And abortion is still legal. Want to emphasize that. Nothing has happened. So if that's something you still need, that's what you should really pursue. And consider if that's sort of what you need at the moment. And then, if there's also Action Canada. So if you're in Canada, they have a confidential access line also. And their number is also 1-888-642-2725. So I wanted to make sure we share those resources.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those, Manu. And I hope people educate themselves more about this issue and kind of understand the complexity of how this can impact people's lives based on where they are and kind of where they're coming from in a very different way than I think the two strokes of right and wrong painted by the media.
Yeah, it's definitely not one or the other. It's not good versus bad. It's definitely shouldn't be seen in that light. And it's really interesting how polarized we've become because of our political landscape. But I also, want to say if you have any questions or want us to talk more about this topic in a different way or have missed something that you think is necessary to also mention, reach out to us for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop recording.
Yeah.